Hello, everyone. It's 5:30. So I think it's fair to say that we're delighted and honoured to be hosting Professor Derick Wade at the CNR today. So Derick will be well known to many of you as one of the most prominent figures in UK rehabilitation. He had a diverse medical training of his own, having trained in neurology, neurosurgery, neurophysiology, and psychiatry before working and researching in stroke rehabilitation as a consultant at the Rivermead Rehab Centre in Oxford. And Derick played a foundational role in developing my specialty in the UK, which is rehabilitation medicine, and more personally encouraging me in the last couple of years to set up the BSPRM Collaborative Research Network. Derick is co-author of many of the defining textbooks and guidelines in rehab medicine. Fundamentally, he's an advocate for holistic biopsychosocial models of care. And for anyone who doesn't know Derick, in 2021, he set up a website that you should all go and check out, which is Rehabilitation Matters. And it's an absolute treasure trove of all things rehabilitation. And I thought I would just read this quote from his landing page, because I think it really captures his views really well. It says, "This site is unashamedly evangelical about rehabilitation, its importance to patients and their families, its never-ending fascination, and its intellectual, philosophical, ethical, and emotional challenges." So with that, I'd like to hand over to Derick to talk to us about what's important in rehabilitation.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, and thank you very much for asking me to do this. It's made me think about, well, what is important in rehabilitation, a topic I've thought about but never actually written about or done anything much about. So what I'm going to do is to start by saying, consider a couple of things. Spinal cord injury, people with spinal cord injury. In about the 1920s, 100 years ago or so, they didn't really have a very good life or a very long life. They were socially excluded, would be in residential care, and they would die. And that was how it was. By about 1960, people could expect to live in the community, many of them, to work, to be part of society, and had a reasonable, although not entirely, normal life expectancy, with most of that progress over a 20-year period between 35 and 55. And that all occurred despite no major advances in the treatment of spinal cord injury. So we know better at managing spinal cord injury in the sense of making it better now than we were 100 years ago. So that's a challenge. How did that happen? If we move on to stroke, which is another area I've been interested in, as you can see, and you can read the quotation there, but a systematic review of stroke unit studies, randomized studies, trialing stroke unit care, came to that conclusion. And that was a time in 1997 when really there was no medical treatment that would alter mortality rates, and many drug companies would have given large sums of money to achieve that sort of change. And again, going back to polio as another example, between about 1930s and 40s, the whole treatment of polio changed from being bed rest because you mustn't strain the muscles to being exercise and getting on. So these are three conditions where we've made a big difference without any medical advance. And I suppose my question is up there, you can read it for yourself, but what is it about rehabilitation that transforms the outlook for people with conditions of acute onset that get somewhat better, or people who have infections that takes their motor neurons away or whatever, and people with spinal cord injury? How is it that we do that? There's no single drug, there's no operation, there's no bit of technology. The natural history of these conditions hasn't changed, so they're all suddenly getting better. And my hypothesis, which I'm going to share with you, is that the vital factor is thinking in a rehabilitation manner. to start it off, and then we'll go into detail, I think what I mean by that is, first of all, as rehabilitationists, we are interested in the person's social function, their priorities, their activities, what life is like for them. And having been a patient of the biomedical approach, that isn't always what comes across to me as the main interest of the biomedical model. And it is thereafter, where having got that, it's an iterative approach which is outlined there. I should say these slides will all be available for you as far as I'm concerned, so you don't need to make notes or anything. And some of them I will skip over because you'll be able to read the details in the slides when you get hold of them. But essentially, it's a reiterative process or an iterative process, sorting out the problems, looking at the causes, thinking of some actions that you might do, selecting a few, doing it, and moving on. But the central part of it is you're centered on the person. And the success is really being systematic and basing it on sound theories which cover what is a person? What do I mean by being a person? What's the understanding of what's important to a person? And then turning that into a model which explains it all, which allows you to analyze it. To know something about what happens after somebody becomes ill. What is the natural change? What is happening when you fall ill? And then the reasoning process, which is going to be based really upon those top three. So that is what I think underlies successful thinking, and I'm now going to expand upon that to try and explain to you what I really think is happening. So let's start with being person-centered. We, I hope, center on the person and not on their disease or any other particular aspect. So we may be involved in assistive technology service or some other specialist service, a behavioural modification service, but I hope and think that if we're interested in rehabilitation in our own area, we still think of the person, and we don't think, how can I make this person fit my treatment? What you have to do is think, how do I make my treatment fit the person? So you do have to think of them as a whole, and you need to have some understanding of personhood. At the bottom there you'll see it says embodied. What I mean by this, and I'm not going to discuss it here, but if you've got questions you can always ask, that I think we have to accept that there is not a separation between body and mind. That the person is their body and their mind, it's all one. There is no distinction. And they have a context. And I'm just going to build this up in a series of very short little slides. I enjoy making diagrams to try to make me think anyway, and I hope perhaps they're useful to you. So we've got a person, and the person has a body, and the person is the body, and they're one. And that body has lots of organs in it which can go wrong from time to time. That person, as we all are, is set in a physical context. This place, what it's like, I mean, if I was in a wheelchair, I'd have grave difficulties getting here. The context is the world out there, the tube stations, the weather, all of those things. That includes the fact of glasses, which I carry around with me. That's part of my physical context, because I can't see without them. My hearing aids, even my hip, I suppose, I'm not sure. And our social context is the people we interact with. And that's, you sort of might say, well, that's sort of the social context of London or of the UK. But it's primarily family, colleagues, friends, religious groups, or any other groups that you're part of. And the broader social context is important, but not half as important as what your family think or what your best friend thinks. So that's something that you have to take into account when thinking of a person. Now, the person, of course, carries their own personal factors, personality with them. And there's all sorts of ways you can break them up. And this is just an example of 7 sort of headings you can stick it under. So the person, in a sense, it's their situation. So they have their own commitments, their stage of life, the resources they have, the money they have, the housing they have, and so on. They'll have personality traits, which are given in most people. They will have certain values that they put importance on. They have behavioural characteristics, the sort of way they move, the way they talk, sort of their way of doing things. They all vary from person to person. We all have bodily characteristics. And in rehabilitation, I think we sometimes forget that. And we forget that what somebody looks like is part of them. And of course, people who get facial burns and scars, that changes. And we have to think about how that affects the person and their rehabilitation. They have beliefs about health and illness, and they have a sense of identity, who they are. And that's based on sort of their life story to this point. Talk about narrative identity if you wish. But it's a continuity, the sort of person I am. So these are all factors you should, I would argue, consider undertaking rehabilitation. And look at them as neither good or bad. They're not judgmental. It's just what you have, and you have to work with it. Now, we all have a past, and hopefully most of us will have a future. So the past is really your experience, and you must factor that in to how you approach this person. So somebody who's had 2 or 3 minor strokes, recovered well and gone back to work, and then comes to you for rehabilitation after their next stroke, will have a very different outlook on what the future holds from somebody else whose father died from a stroke suddenly, mother had a stroke that was left her severely disabled, and maybe her sister's had a stroke and is left severely disabled. They have a very different experience. So it's really important to get a view of what their experience is and the sorts of places they lived and their social context in the past. And in the same way, we have a future. They have goals and things they're thinking about, hopes. And for those who read the website, I think hope is actually something we don't talk about very much, and we should talk about a lot more. Because they have hopes, there's no point ignoring that. And there's quite a lot of stuff written about, actually it's not a dangerous area to talk about, it's quite a good area to talk about. So there's all of that. And then if you take that thing at the bottom that says personal context, so all of that stuff around the outside is, in a sense, important stuff that you must think about when you're trying to think about the person and who they are and what they are and how you're trying to help them. So that figure on the next one that's coming up in a minute or two is really illustrating what one would call the system, as in general systems theory type of system, which is, of course, is hierarchical. You have higher level systems and lower level systems and subsystems and so on. And the important thing about that is that systems the relationships are non-linear. So it isn't a given that if you increase strength by 6%, that they will get 6% better at whatever it is that strength's concerned with. They're interactive, so if you have partial sensory loss and partial motor loss, not very severe in either. They may be a very severe loss, whereas if you had a fairly severe motor loss but no sensory loss, or vice versa, it may be much less loss. So there's a lot of interaction and a lot of bidirectional effects, which means that it's, mathematically speaking, a complex system. And the importance of that is that you cannot predict what will happen if you change something. You can have a go at it and make some sort of probabilities, but you won't know for an individual what the result will be. So the next theory, I think, is, well, what's the model you get from this one? Nobody will be surprised to learn that I would argue it's the biopsychosocial model of illness. An updated version, I would say, from the original version 1977 and the WHO versions in the ICIDH and then the International Classification of Functioning. And this is the one that, for those who don't know, I've written about in 2017, which basically says there are four systems: the organs making the body interacting with social and physical context and behaviour and social interaction, and there's four contexts. What I think the WHO and everybody else missed out was you do have to think of the person in front of you in time. How are they in their life? Where are they in their life? Because that carries lots of implications about expectations and responsibilities and resources, and also where are they in their illness? And we tend to forget that. And for lots of people that I see in my current work in a care home have quite rare diseases. Two people with genetic Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, never seen a case before, and now I have two. But their families know far more about it than I do, and I don't pretend otherwise because they've been through it all. So you've got to think of where this person is in their illness, what their experience has been. Most of the models of health sort of overlook the fact that we all have choice. We all make choices, and we all bemoan the fact that the person doesn't do what we wish them to do. But actually that is part of life, and we should recognise that and talk about it with the patients and with their families or whoever it is. And of course you can say, well, the whole thing is determined, but I have a slightly more optimistic view that people do make choices. And when analysing outcomes, you've got to think of something like well-being, which is ultimately what that person thinks is right for them and how they think they are, which may be completely different to what you think. So you can get a sort of copy of it if you haven't already seen it from that website, which is the original clinical rehabilitation publication. So that's the model. You can look at it as a picture like this, which reminds you that everything in red inside that box with a blue background is the person, and it's all invisible to you as a person sitting outside. So they make choices, they have feelings about well-being, they have all their attitudes. You can't see that. You have to judge it from their behaviour. They may or may not have a disease. They will have experiences of the body itself, which impairments. And they're sitting in a physical context, top half, and they interact with that, and that is their behaviour, which you might call their activities, and if it's not going well, their disability. And on the bottom half, they have a social context where they interact socially. And one of the things, well, just the right-hand half is time. And one of the things that I sometimes talk to medical students about is to ask people, if you go to a wedding and you're sat at the table, as usual, with people you don't know, that's my experience of weddings anyway, when you introduce yourself, you will introduce yourself in your social role. You will say how you know the bride or bridegroom. You will say something about yourself. You're interested in fishing, or that you work as a doctor or as a nurse or whatever it might be. You won't say, I'm really good at running and I can get dressed in 25 minutes and I can cook an egg. And yet those are the things that we measure in rehabilitation. We don't measure their roles, we measure their function. But who of you would go into a wedding and say, I can do these things? It's a given. It's a point. You do them for the role. So this is a useful diagram which you can look at. This is not expecting you to read this, but it's in detail, and you can look at that and see all the sort of bits that I've put in there, which is just reconstructing it in another way. And that's all. It encompasses most of what I said on the first theory. So these two theories are really interrelated. I think it's worth, I'm just writing about this on the web fairly soon, but it's worth noting that the concepts in the biopsychosocial model of illness are concepts. And you can get into endless arguments about whether or not hand function is an impairment or is going to be a disability, or is a weakness an impairment or a disability. And you can argue endlessly about all of these things on what is social participation. Is cooking food a social thing or social participation or an activity? But they're all defined in a sense by their interactions, and it depends on which context you're looking at it as to what exactly you're going to label something. I think despite its difficulty with the concepts, it's extremely useful in classifying data systematically, for constructing summaries of what people are like, structuring records. Unfortunately, I don't know of any electronic patient records yet that have managed to get around to doing this, but they should do. The framework contains an implicit theory of relationships, and one mustn't forget, and there's no point in pretending that rehabilitation is everything. There are obviously lower levels, genes and cells and other things, and there are higher levels, sort of social organisations and countries that lie outside this. But the biopsychosocial model covers most of what is important to a person. So that's sort of one theory, or one couple of theories. And the next theory is one that I've written about, and I think I was asked by Diane actually to speak about this and to speak about rehabilitation. And I was walking around wondering about rehabilitation, and I thought, well, how would you design a study, a randomized study, to give somebody no rehabilitation? So do you mean that after their stroke you put them in a room, close the door, and that's it? Or do you let someone go in and feed them? Or do you let someone go in and actually help them sit up in their bed or turn over in their bed? What is no rehabilitation? And I found it very difficult to answer that. So I'm now going to tell you the sort of upshot of my thought about that. So illness is only one of many things that we face that changes in our life, and we adapt. We adapt to our aging, to accidents, car breaks down, the tube breaks down, whatever it might be. It's something that is integral to all life, everything. And generally we try to maintain some sort of equilibrium. And the next slide, unfortunately, says much the same, puts in an idea that adaptation is central to all living organisms, and as a sort of thought you can go away with, are organisations living because they adapt, complex adaptive systems. Humans adapt as they go along to changes, so when they grow up or they get older, changes in social status, if they become unemployed, they'll change jobs, the physical environment changes, we adapt automatically. And some of our adaptations are quite quick. If the car breaks down, we adapt there and then and get a train. And as new technology comes on, some of us adapt more quickly than others, but we get used to it. But we have sort of long-term things that remain reasonably constant. And as things happen, you ask for help. So if your car breaks down, you go and ask a mechanic what to do about it. If you're getting divorced, you go and see a lawyer to sort out some of the practical issues. There are lots of things that we get help with. That's just part of life. So if you experience a change due to illness, you have a stroke, not too bad, you're taken into hospital, put into bed. If you've lost the use of your right arm, you'll automatically use your left arm to press the bell, to feed yourself, to call for help, or whatever it might be. I've got a dodgy right hip at the moment. I walk with a limp from time to time, and I've adapted the way I walk and the way I go up and down stairs. All sorts of things you do as part of the illness. I bought myself hearing aids and glasses. And sometimes you talk about this as natural recovery, and sometimes you talk about it as compensation. So we alter what we do and how we do it and what we're trying to achieve, and we do that from the moment the illness starts. So I broke my leg years ago and had a plaster on and didn't really have any rehabilitation. I adapted, and then as it got better, I adapted again and got back to reasonably normal. And this is all an attempt to retain some sort of equilibrium. And we do that automatically for our physiological variables. But I would argue that we do it in our sort of psychosocial life. And we talk glibly about work-life balance, which is a sort of homeostasis that most of us in this room are probably fairly bad at, or at least we do more on the work than the life. And the balance you draw in your own life is between different things that you prioritize. Is it more income or seeing friends or going fishing or whatever it might be? And to an extent, how much do I really want to achieve in work as against what I do with this society, looking into the past or whatever it is. So we have this system set up to balance. In terms of rehabilitation, there are obviously lots of motivational needs theories, and the one that I think is quite useful is Maslow's hierarchy, which probably many people have heard of to an extent anyway, which says we're all driven by basic needs, physiological needs, safety needs, security, accommodation and resources, and then less of a hierarchy, belonging and relationships with people, esteem, and what's called self-actualization, which you can break up. And this is one way you can deal with it, and you might, for example, use this when constructing goals with somebody. Think of, well, what sort of things are you interested in being affiliated with, and how are you going to meet people in your social networks? And I would suggest that we set up some sort of equilibrium so that we balance physiologically, which we don't think about, that happens unconsciously, but socially and psychologically, we sort of end up with a balance for ourselves, and sometimes we're not in balance. And we have behaviours, we change behaviours so that we can meet our psychosocial goals. So physiologically you change levels of insulin or whatever it might be, but in our behaviours we change our behaviours. I met Orlando just now, who's going out to family dinner tonight rather than coming here. His behaviour is that's more important to look after his family than to come and listen to me. Bad choice, but never mind. It's what he did. So we do this automatically. It's something we do. And if you read the article I've written in Clinical Rehabilitation, you'll see this. And again, I don't want you to look at all the details, but essentially, on the left-hand side, there's the person. And that person has body structure and function, and within that body they have networks that try to maintain this homeostasis. And the person can then has capabilities or actions within a physical context and within their social context, which they do, have a whole lot of needs on the right-hand side, which is their goals or their motivating needs, which they try to satisfy, and they act in a way, and the little signs coming up from physical and social context say changes there may change the balance. And so you can see there's a sort of circle, how well am I meeting my needs, what do I need to do about it, and what do I adjust? And that's a sort of very crude diagram of how we maintain some sort of balance in our lives. Illness is somewhat different from all the other changes I've talked about, because most of the other changes are outside you and you're reacting to them. If you're ill, it's inside you. Some part of you has changed in some way. And so how you adapt may itself be affected, particularly if brain function's altered, but in other systems as well. two consequences arise from that. The first is that you become eligible for healthcare. And I don't know how many of you know sort of Talcott Parsons, who wrote in about 1950s about sick roll and so on. There's a sort of contract. If you're ill, society will look after you, but you're responsible for making sure you get better as quickly as you can. And part of that is that we offer help, rehabilitation. And I would argue that biomedical healthcare, in a sense quite correctly because it's not its business, is not that concerned with adaptation, but we in rehabilitation should be absolutely concerned with adaptation. And my hypothesis is that you could argue the primary purpose of rehabilitation is to facilitate how that individual adapts to their illness. And we want the person to achieve a new, sustainable biopsychosocial equilibrium, which in the next slide, I think, I illustrate again using Maslow's things. And the only bits you need to look at are the green squares with RE written in them. There's one down the left, middle there, top, somewhere over there. So they are showing where rehabilitation will intervene within this. So it might help somebody change their goals. You might increase their capabilities. You might alter their physical context or their social context. These are areas that we can interact and do something. But it's all set in the context of a normal adaptive process. So just to put some words behind that, a lot of the time we do spend, particularly on inpatient rehabilitation units, helping somebody with their capabilities, helping them to be more capable at doing whatever it might be, which might be as simple as walking or getting around, or might be as complex as working and holding down a job. And we assist that. We can alter the physical context. We can alter that by arranging adaptations at home or providing people with equipment that helps them and teaching them how to use it and giving them advice on what's available. We can alter their social context sort of specifically for an individual in terms of adjusting and teaching and helping families or friends or others to know how best to manage them, how to transfer them if necessary, how to increase their independence, and those sorts of things. And then we help the person looking at their internal, social, personal context, helping them to see how they might maintain their interest but slightly change what they're aiming at. And I don't think we can say, you must do this, you must do that, but you could explore with them what's important in their life using Maslow or some other scheme, and saying, right, well, the important things in your life are this, you can't do it this way, but if you do it this way and set yourself a slightly less ambitious target, you'll probably be all right. And there's emotional adaptation, sort of coping strategies. And these are all things that we can do to assist, but it is assisting the person in their adaptation. And we're coming near the end now, so it's really saying that the way we do this, and I think this is the important things we do, are to make an accurate diagnosis. And the thing that I see, I do some second opinions, not purely on prolonged disorders of consciousness, but on people where there's a disagreement somewhere along the line between the person, the family, the ICB, the rehab team, or whatever it might be. And often, I think, the problem is they've not made a proper diagnosis, have not really tried to understand where this person is and how this person fits in, and how the ICB, who's part of your environment, fits into it. And there's somebody I've seen in nameless county down south, where the ICB really want to send this person somewhere to have rehabilitation, to make them better, so that then they're not troubled by the relatives. This chap lives in a hamlet. There's about 22 houses. It's about 3 miles to the next nearest house. He's had severe brain damage from abscesses. He's mobile, he can walk. He's a bit disinhibited, not very. He's easily led, he's vulnerable, he's not black, but he's certainly he would pass as black. His father's very aware that he's vulnerable to being picked up by the police if he comes somewhere like London where his other family members live. And all that the ICB want to do is to send him somewhere so that he'll be better and then he can come back and everything will be all right. And they haven't really picked up that he's living in this place. He's safe where he is, but he can't live there forever. His parents don't want him to live there forever. And trying to see him as a person has been an uphill battle for 2 years, and they still haven't got it. And they just don't understand the diagnosis. Having made a diagnosis, then I think a lot of what we do is to catalyse change. So one of my projects years ago was doing an acute head injury service, and we used to go into the John Radcliffe Hospital and see people with head injury, and the thing we did most times was to say, actually, they can go home. They'll be all right. And we didn't do anything. And when they got home, we'd follow them up. And by the time we'd followed them up, they were much better. And about 90% of the interaction was see them, support them, bit of advice, they're okay. And then smaller proportion, you actually do something about assisting adaptation. But that's a relatively small proportion of all the people who have rehabilitation. So looking at it, again, don't worry about the outside bits. This is what sort of main roles are. Making a diagnosis up on the top left. The role that I haven't mentioned so far is supporting. So we have a role not in, as part of rehabilitation, providing support long term, but in determining what support somebody might need in the long term in terms of care, what sort of environment they need, what equipment they need, what sort of care they need, and how it's going to happen. So that's the bottom left. Then we have some catalytic activities, which are things where the involvement of the rehabilitation service can make a huge difference, but you only need to do it once. It's not dose related. It's a matter of making the diagnosis, giving advice, support, maybe psychological support, giving them a plan, and then maybe seeing them if they need to, but you may not need to. And then there's the bit that everybody thinks of most, which is this bottom right-hand corner, where you're teaching usually patient or other people things. But that, I would argue, is a relatively small part of rehabilitation, but it's the part everybody focuses on, partly because it's the most resource intensive, partly because it sort of fits in with the biomedical model, whereas the rest of that doesn't. But I would argue that's equally important way of thinking about it. This is just expanding a bit on the supportive roles. We have to, obviously naturally really manage pain or distress, all the unpleasant things that go along with it. That's something we do and probably do better than a lot of other people. Providing support in the long term. And we'll be moderately expert. We're not palliative care experts, but we have to do an awful lot of palliative care anyway. The last thing is the reasoning, and really this is based on what I've just said. Now, clinical reasoning, if you look it up in the literature, has lots of different meanings, and I'm really talking about collecting information, coming to formulation, looking at your evidence about prognosis and potential interventions. Enablement theories are really theories that explain how factors relate to each other, of which there are very few theories, using your experience, and then you plan, advise and act and justify your decisions. And reading a lot of notes, as I have done and do, I think we're pretty poor at explaining to anybody, ourselves included, why we've made the decision, and certainly trying to get out of the notes why things are happening is almost impossible. If you go back and look at your goal planning records and look at the goals you set, you don't understand, at least I never understood when I went back on ours, why these goals were there. I could see where they're going, but you don't understand the reasoning behind it. I'll skip this just to say predictions and explanations are always uncertain. We have to live with uncertainty in rehabilitation more than most other people, I think. And you have these theories that try to explain it, and this is 2 articles that are worth reading about treatment theories or enablement theories. It depends on who you read as to what you call it. They're put forward as being a way of predicting what's going to happen, but I don't think, if one's honest, that we can predict very well what will happen if we do this. We can say it's quite likely, or it's not very likely to do something, but you cannot predict. I think we live with this. What the problem is that commissioners cannot live with this because they want a standard prediction of what you're going to do. I'm going to skip that one. So, wait a minute. Yeah, sorry. So what I'm saying here is that, yes, we have to have evidence. It's important, but I don't think it's very important. But it tells you, evidence goes through trials of what might make a difference and how likely it is. But theories say we're never predicting an individual. And in practice, therefore, we have to tailor our interventions to the individual and evaluate and then change it, tailor it. And does that work? It does work. There's quite a lot of evidence which is sort of summarised in that article, showing that having an approach which is iterative and tailors and does work. So to finish, rehabilitation must be person-centred and therefore must be holistic and work within a comprehensive framework, and its role is to facilitate adaptations. And then on the right-hand side are the sorts of things you can do, 3 facilitatory roles, supportive roles. We operate in a complex system and we have to tailor what we do to the individual. And the features of rehabilitation thinking, and this is the last slide I've given here. So your thinking should be person-centred and mustn't forget the person's longer-term, high-level goals and expectations and attitudes and hopes. Your thinking should be set within a holistic model that takes into account or thinks about, you don't have to think about all of it, but wonders whether something in some of those other areas is important. You're working to facilitate adaptation. You use clinical reasoning based on evidence and experience. And you have 2 key outputs from your thinking: formulation and actions tailored to their needs. So this is what I think, retrospectively, is the explanation for our success in spinal cord injury and in stroke and in many other conditions. Undoubtedly we're successful, and I think if we remember this, then we're a lot further ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Derick. So now I would like to open the floor just to invite anyone that has any questions for Derick. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, all points of discussion. We've got a little bit of time. We are recording it, so we're going to hand out the microphone just to capture. Thank you.
Brave man. Thank you.
Well, I was still trying to formulate a question in my mind, but I guess it relates partly to, if I can kind of characterise your view about prediction or prognosis in a slightly negative about it. I mean, that may not be what you believe. In terms of approaches to treat the person, should it be so, treat the person in terms of what their needs are in the moment or what their needs are in the future? So where does the idea of prognosis fit in? Is it possible that an approach that you take to an individual based on their needs at that time will actually have a negative impact on their longer term outcome?
Okay, so pick up on the first point. I mean, I'm not perhaps being as negative as it might have sounded about prognosis. Clearly, you have to work on the prognosis of something like an acute stroke. You can be reasonably good at making a prognosis about that. I think it's much more difficult to make a prognosis or prediction about the effect of a specific treatment. So I think all I'm trying to say on that front is, and I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody here, but it is a surprise to people who fund rehabilitation, who expect you to be able to say, if we do A, B, and C for this length of time, at this level of intensity, you will achieve X, Y, and Z. And I just think we must fight back against that collectively, and we know that to an extent. And you say, well, I think it's a 50% likelihood. You guess a figure out of the air. But in terms of their needs, I think in some ways you have to be not schizophrenic, but you have to think both of their, I mean, they obviously have immediate care needs apart from anything else, and immediate needs. I think you just always got to set it in the longer term. So I would frequently ask people who came to see me late after stroke or whatever, and they usually, let's say, wanted to walk. And I would ask them, why do you want to walk? And they would look at me as if I was mad. And so, of course I want to walk. And I say, but what would you do if you could walk? And they begin to then say what they would like to do. And I get a feel for what they want. And then you can start to have a discussion about, well, yes, if you just want to achieve that much, that is achievable. But if you want to achieve running a marathon, it's not achievable. And you can start to have discussions about what's sensible. And I very well remember a patient who came to see me, came armed with 2 doctors. And he came from Hereford to be assessed for 2 weeks inpatient rehabilitation in Oxford. He'd had some horrible spinal cord inflammatory disorder in the West Indies, and I don't know what its nature was, but he'd left really unable to walk. And I said to him, he came without his wife, which I thought was very telling, because this was a sort of key decision in his life, and she wasn't there. And I said to him, you have a choice. I said, if you spend the next 10 years walking 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, no doubt your walking could get better and you could walk, I don't know, 100 yards. I said, in the meantime, you'd have lost all your friends and everything, or you can get along on a powered wheelchair, standing transfers, occasional short steps, and have a life. He understood, but his 2 medical friends were really angry because I wasn't going to admit him. I said, in 2 weeks, we can achieve nothing. It's pointless. So I think our main thought is you need to think about whatever it is you can do and think, but in the context of this person in 10 years' time, is that relevant? And if you think it is, and if they agree that it is, that's fine. But I see quite a lot of times people who have a treatment that they think is good for the person, but haven't stopped to think what it means to them. And I think there is also a slight worry sometimes about raising expectations of a cure because you can make something better. Sort of memory rehab is not a cure for memory. It helps you get a bit better. And as long as they understand the limits, that's fine.
Anyone else?
You know you don't get any wine if you don't ask.
So you've defined the rehabilitative thinking.
So I don't think the microphone's
No,
working.
I was thinking that as well. Yeah, okay. We can repeat the question on the mic here. So, yeah.
Is it on now? Oh, that's good.
Perfect.
So you've defined the rehabilitative thinking and the distinction between that or the interaction with clinical reasoning. And there needs to be some sort of delivery. So let's say there are people who really want the rehab because they really want to improve their speech or cognition or motor function or whatever it is, and we can see that the clinical reasoning says that can happen. Where do you think the role is of helping with the delivery of that? Because there's a huge deficit in.
So if you repeat the question, I'm sorry, I'm a bit deaf. I can't quite hear. I don't think the microphone's working at all.
For people, can you hear me now? All right. For people who can clearly benefit from intensive rehabilitation, what are your thoughts on how that can be delivered? Because there's a huge deficit in services to do that. Do you think that any of the decision making could be taken over, for example, or helped by, rather than the human intelligence, machine learning and artificial intelligence?
I mean, in terms of the people who would benefit, I work in a care home in Gloucester. And it's quite interesting to me because we have a lot of people who are turned down by level 1 units for one reason or another, including people with spinal cord injury, high spinal cord injury. What we offer, I think, which is different from the OC, the Oxford Centre for Enablement, where I worked once upon a time, is that it's much more of an environment that is designed for rehabilitation so that the care assistants and everybody else takes things forward. So the therapist can put in their time, but you need to have an environment where the individual is encouraged and enabled to do it. And I think we sort of, a lot of very skilled therapy time is spent doing something which can be done by somebody else once they've been set up and identify what to do. So I think that we're not very good collectively as a healthcare system setting up systems that enable that to happen. I mean, in Dutch care homes that I went to, patients were expected to go and get their own coffee and serve their own meals, and yet at the Oxford Centre for Enablement, a nurse would come around and serve it to you. What's that about? I mean, half the people there could get up and walk and serve the other half, but we didn't do that. I think we have to change the way the institution thinks so that the institution is person-centred. And there's a very interesting article by somebody called Tiago Jesus that makes this point, that actually a lot of rehabilitationists are fairly person-centred. But if you don't have a managerial culture, then you lose it. You can't take it forwards.
But I've just to expand on that. I was wondering where you think there is a role for technology in helping with that. So it could be, for example, in smart homes, in environments where there's some sort of monitoring going on using technology.
I suppose I'm a cynic on technology on the whole because I think we attribute huge miracle powers to it. But I think simple technology is really useful stuff. Even just providing wheelchairs. We get patients coming in from rehab centres without a wheelchair. And these are people who could easily get around in a wheelchair. I think we don't use the technology we have very well. We don't teach people how to use it. We make it too complicated. It's getting simpler. I think in terms of feedback, we probably underuse it in feeding back on how people are doing. Even sort of smartwatches just telling you how much you walk. I don't think we use the technology that exists, all that well. And I think that changing the physical context, changing where somebody lives, which includes technology, but not necessarily high technology, is a huge difference. it makes a vast difference to people. So yes, we sort of separate it out. So where I work, we use the Bristol Communication Aid Centre. It's not called that anymore. But it's a long way away, and they have to come up, and there's all sorts of criteria. We don't seem to be able to just have it as part of life. And even in the Oxford Centre for Enablement, where we had a specialist disability service, we in the neurological bit couldn't use that unless we went through a very long, protracted referral route through ICBs so that we could get, all they had to do was go across the corridor and see somebody. We couldn't do it.
All right. I think if there's no other questions, well, Derick will be staying with us for some more time. So I think would love to continue the chat over refreshments outside. So we'll invite all of you to join us. So I'd just like to say thank you again to Derick for a fantastic talk. And thank you.